Welcome to this inaugural book launch for the Comparative and International Education Society that was established for the first time by the president-elect of the Comparative and International Education Society, Supriya Bailey. I am Beverly Lindsay, the editor and contributing author of several chapters to our volume, Comparative and International Education, Leading Perspectives from the Field. We express appreciation to our Palgrave editor, Milana Vernikova. So we acknowledge the contribution of our authors, and then we move to the foreword that was written by Ambassador and Professor Emeritus Dr. Horace G. Dawson from Howard University. Ambassador Dawson discusses the importance of education in various venues throughout the globe. He discusses the importance of senior scholars contributing to the field of comparative and international education. As we move to the next two slides, we note the preface. We do our work through theories, through research and policies, with the ultimate aim of engaging in teaching, scholarship, and public engagement, so that education is an indispensable social vehicle for improving the lives of all people, whether they are 2 years old or whether they're 99 years of age. We think that education is very important, and this must be linked to our public engagement roles. As we move to the next slide, we begin to see the different parts of our volume. The landscape for comparative and international education addresses, or at least outlines initially, some of the key issues and questions that we will be raising. For example, in part one, the conceptual, historical, and theoretical frameworks are discussed. Professor Carnoy, who is the Vida Jacks Professor of Education at Stanford University, discusses his long career in the field, but he also discusses the importance of testing. Part two, as we note in the slide, examines pedagogical, gender, and global engagement through the field of what I term as teaching. This presentation that covers briefly the 3 chapters in this area is by distinguished James McGill Professor Ratna Ghosh of McGill University. As we move to part 3, as shown on the PowerPoint slide, we examine policies, practices, and paradigms that emerge, and they are very intricately related to applied research. Dr. Joel Samoff of Stanford University will be presenting in this particular part of our volume. We'll be discussing the different ways that comparative and international education is examined or viewed by people in country versus external funding agencies. In part 4, which is the final part of our volume, we're moving forward in the new decade. This is now the 3rd decade in the 21st century. We want to traverse or move beyond the current boundaries and examine pressing issues such as climate change, such as social conflict, which we are witnessing now. We also are examining the effects of unheard of, comprehensive issues that are affecting people every single day, such as the pandemic. So in other words, we are linking the field of comparative and education, comparative and international education, beyond the classroom, beyond the ivory tower, beyond the academy, to see how it affects people in real life through policies, through applied research and practices. Now we turn to part 1, by Professor Carnoy, who is the Vitus Jack Professor at Stanford University. Professor Carnoy.
Thank you very much, Beverly. My essay in this wonderful book is about the evolution of comparative education during my academic lifetime, from the beginning of the 1960s until the present. During the first part of this period, comparative education became much more important because of the Cold War and the interest in the US and Europe to focus on economic development as a counter to communism. Education was seen as a way to promote economic growth and democracy. Now, during this period, social science was being pushed as a way to study education because of this overriding emphasis on economic and social development. And the pressure to gather more data, also coming from the social science perspective, led to the first international tests in the mid-1960s. They were not meant to directly compare the quality of education in different countries, surprisingly, but rather to provide an empirical basis for understanding the impact of various educational policies across countries. By the 1970s, this same social science perspective led to a new kind of analysis in comparative education, a critical analysis of education's role in colonialism and reproducing inequality. Some of us began writing about the political economy of education, especially about education in the context of state theory. Others developed world society theory, a way of looking at educational systems comparatively in the context of overarching world culture or ideology. With increased globalization and the more active role of international agencies such as World Bank, UNESCO, and eventually the OECD, the locus of comparative education shifted to those institutions. In the 1980s, the World Bank was probably doing as much research in comparative education as all the leading universities combined. The common theme, just like back in the 1960s, was education as an input into economic growth. By the end of the 1990s, however, it was the international testing agencies, the IEA with its TIMSS test, and then the OECD with its PISA test, which began to dominate the field and set the agenda in comparative education. Clearly, the OECD today, the OECD PISA test, is where a major focus of comparative education lies. And as usual, the driving force and rationale behind its message of improving educational quality through comparative analysis is economic growth. I argue that the second major focus for comparative education today is impact evaluation, which is being done largely in universities, and with it, impact investment being done by large financial institutions moving into the education field. All of this has the same narrow effectiveness rationale as pushed by the OECD. My essay ends with a simple question: whatever happened to theory in comparative education? I appeal to the younger generation to bring it back, and to bring it back in political economic forms, as well as to support it with sound empirical work. Indeed, even using test results to better understand what education systems are really doing in different nations to make things better or worse for the mass of young people. Thank you, Beverly, for allowing me to participate in this excellent volume. I think it's going to be very, very useful for the CIES and for all comparative educators around the world.
We really appreciate your contributions to the volume. Now we will turn to part 2 that deals with pedagogy and global engagements by Dr. Ratna Ghosh of McGill University. Ratna.
It is a great honor and an exciting experience for me to be involved in this project with fellows of CIES who have been leaders in the field of comparative and international education for several decades. It is hoped that this interdisciplinary volume will help emerging professionals move CIE forward to advance equity and justice in the world. Section 2 on pedagogical epistemologies, genders, and global engagements puts forward the rationale to expand the field by including issues of social justice and equity through focusing on gender and other differences, the need for social cohesion in an interdependent world by overcoming differences, and how these factors impact teacher education and teachers who are crucial in developing attitudes and values in students. CIES has been in the forefront of expanding the field to include a variety of activities related to gender by attracting innovative researchers through its Standing Committee on Gender and Education. Vandra Massaman established the GEC, and Nellie Stromquist, among others, has been an inspirational and powerful contributor to studies on gender and society. Advocating for inclusion of gender in CIE, she suggests a gender theory-based approach and critical questioning of patriarchal ideologies as essential for new generations to be empowered and have agency for creating gender equality globally. CIES is well poised to ensure that research in this area continues to be an important part of the society and the field. Written at a time when COVID-19 was causing a crisis unprecedented in recent times, my chapter examines education's role in recognizing the need for social cohesion in an interdependent world to meet global challenges. I focus on the importance of teachers to have inclusive classrooms, which are now super diverse due to the intersection of differences in gender and gender identity, ethnicity, culture, class, disabilities, and religion. Teachers play a vital role in developing a critical understanding of the world and global-minded citizens, and suggests a humanistic pedagogy for peace and a sustainable future. Mark Ginsburg reiterates the importance of teachers and teacher education by recognizing teachers as a focus of comparative educators and pointing to the recognition, particularly in UNESCO documents, that teachers are the key to quality education and need to be empowered, motivated, and remunerated. He argues that teachers remain devalued, although their significance has long been acknowledged by comparative educators. He appeals for more attention to teachers in CIE, and he has added a detailed list of chapters in textbooks in the field that focus on teachers and teacher education. Thank you very much, Beverly, for doing this wonderful project.
As we turn to part 3, deals with policies, practices, and paradigms, we will now hear from Joel Samoff of Stanford University.
Thank you, Beverly. I took the invitation to contribute to this very distinguished collection by senior scholars on comparative education as an invitation to reflect on the field. And as I did that, it seemed to me that I'm really picking up on a good deal of what Martin talked about. It seemed to me that there are two stories to be told here in comparative education. One is a very upbeat, positive story, a development story. It has its roots in the decolonization of the early part of the 20th century. That decolonization was linked with the notion of development. That in turn was linked with the notion of progress. And that in turn had at its core a notion of education as a vehicle for, in general, improving the human condition more broadly. And that makes of comparative education research a very positive enterprise, an encouraging enterprise. Now, of course, people did many different things, but there is an overall framing. And the overall framing is an important framing because it shapes how it is that comparative education research was being done. And that becomes even more intense, I think, as the 20th century unfolds. UNESCO emerges as the global education organization, and perhaps even more important, there begins to be significant foreign funding for comparative education research. In Africa, where I work, it is the case that comparative education researchers are heavily dependent on foreign funding. That's the case also in the global north. And that makes the research funders the arbiters of research quality. not just the specifiers periodically of particular subjects, but those who determine what it is that is credible research, legitimate research, research worth paying attention to. And as we push this story forward and come toward the end of the 20th century and into the 21st, we need to have then the recognition that the development gap is not closing, that the distance between the richest and the poorest in the world is getting greater, not smaller. And so there emerges a second story, a critical story that insists that if the development gap is not closing, if there is increased distance, if the poverty is not getting less, then there must be powerful forces in the world that prefer an unequal and unjust world. And that critical second story is then a story about demystification, about deconstruction. It's necessarily about liberation. It's necessarily, it's necessarily about transformation. It's not really a single story. There are many strands in the story. There's the Carnoy version of it that Martin referred to, but there's Freire, there are many others. But they're all involved in challenging some of the standard understandings of the first story, of the development story. And as I see it, particularly challenging the way in which research is to be done, what constitutes good research, the notion that good research is in the North, that the generation of knowledge is in the North and controlled and managed in the North. And that poses then a challenge for comparative education researchers, because to fail to challenge those strong givens of research is to become complicit in the organization and management of an unjust world. What's needed in this second story then is to think not only about poverty, but about process. How is it that people in countries become poor? What keeps them poor? And what that says to me, if we're working toward a third story for comparative education research, is that it is essential to distinguish between poor and impoverished. And it is essential to understand why that distinction matters. Thank you, Beverly.
Thank you, Joel. I will make a few final comments based on part 4 of our table of contents. And I would abbreviate that by saying we're moving forward in this third decade of the 21st century. The 3 previous speakers have touched upon several of the issues, but I'd also like to mention a few that are in other chapters, including mine. What will be emerging in the field? And how will we use and need policies to address the challenges to move forward in a positive way? For example, Dr. Ghosh mentioned the pandemic, but there's also climate change. There's regional and global conflict and unrest, which our grant in California from the Ford Foundation addresses. And we certainly see that right now with the Ukraine-Russia situation that is going on, that is just so devastating to education and social policy, not only in those 2 countries, but overall. So we hope that we've lent some insight into what our volume covers, and we can hearken back to what Ambassador Dawson stated in terms of blending diplomacy and external public engagement with what we do in universities in terms of comparative and international education. Thank you for your contributions.